when Ukraine launched its surprise, cross-border incursion into Russia's KURSK Oblast on August 6, 2024, the world was caught completely off guard. What began as what many thought would be a short-lived raid soon transformed into one of the most consequential offensives of the entire Russia-Ukraine war. Analysts at the time struggled to comprehend how Ukraine, already stretched thin defending its own borders, could possibly sustain operations on Russian soil. Yet the improbable happened. Ukraine not only crossed the border, but managed to hold territory for months, inflict catastrophic losses on Russian forces, and force Moscow into a defensive posture few thought possible. This bold gambit exposed some of the deepest flaws in Russia's military doctrine and logistics. What was meant to be a stronghold of Russian sovereignty instead became the site of humiliation, attrition, and massive casualties. The Kursk invasion lasted for roughly 7 months, and by the time the dust settled, the operation had resulted in more Russian losses than nearly any other Ukrainian offensive during the entire war. That alone makes it not only improbable but also improbably successful. To grasp the sheer scale of the campaign's impact, we need to look at the numbers 1 year later. Ukraine's commander-in-chief Oleksandr Syrsky released statistics marking the anniversary of the Kursk incursion, and the figures are staggering. According to Syrsky, over 77,000 Russian soldiers were killed or wounded in Kursk alone. Among those numbers were approximately 4,000 North Korean nationals who had been deployed to fight alongside Russian troops, a desperate and almost surreal detail we'll dive into later. To put that figure into perspective, Russia suffered fewer casualties during the entire First Chechen War, and now, in just a single region, supposedly secure and well within Russia's grasp, Moscow was bleeding manpower at a shocking pace. But the human toll is only one dimension of this disaster. Ukraine systematically dismantled Russia's military presence in Kursk. Syrsky's report cited 736 pieces of Russian military equipment either damaged or destroyed. This list reads like the inventory of a procurement disaster: 211 tanks, 83 armored vehicles, 907 artillery systems, along with 3 helicopters and 1 aircraft shot down. Each destroyed vehicle represents not just millions of dollars in lost investment, but also months of production capacity that Russia cannot replace easily under the weight of sanctions and industrial strain. The operation itself began with what can only be described as a masterclass in deception and unconventional warfare. Starting on August 4th, just 2 days before the formal assault, small Ukrainian special operations teams, groups of 6 soldiers, each slipped across the border under the cover of darkness. These teams hid in forests, performed reconnaissance, and mapped out vulnerabilities in Russian defensive positions. This wasn't the armored blitzkrieg Russia's doctrine was prepared for. Instead, it was a methodical, surgical infiltration that exposed how poorly Russia had prepared for the possibility of a true cross-border incursion. When the main attack began on August 6th, Ukrainian forces achieved results that defied most expert predictions. Within days, the attackers had broken through Russian defenses, disrupting supply lines and logistics hubs deep inside enemy territory. At the height of the operation, Ukraine controlled nearly 500 square miles of Russian land. The speed, coordination, and daring of the advance revealed something deeply unsettling for Russian planners. Their entire border security concept had been built on flawed assumptions. Timing played a pivotal role in why this worked. In the summer of 2024, Russia was reeling from its own failed offensives in the north. Casualties were already high, morale was low, and intelligence indicated Moscow was preparing yet another attack toward Kharkiv. The Sumy region appeared to be the next target, a move that would have forced Ukraine to stretch its defenses, dangerously thin across multiple fronts. Rather than waiting to absorb the blow, Ukraine flipped the script. By striking first, Kyiv seized the initiative and forced Russia to react rather than dictate terms. This strategic choice reshaped the entire front. Russia had to abandon its planned offensive in Sumy, redirecting units that had been earmarked for fresh attacks back toward Kursk to defend its own soil. Reports suggest that Russia moved some 60,000 troops from Donbass alone to Kursk, weakening offensive momentum there. The ripple effects were visible across the battlefield. Ukrainian forces in Zaporizhia and other contested regions noticed reduced Russian artillery fire and fewer infantry assaults. Even brigades stationed in Kaliningrad were redeployed eastward, weakening Russia's deterrence posture against NATO. Yet despite these massive troop movements, Russia struggled to mount an effective response. For the first month, counterattacks were sporadic and poorly coordinated. The rigid hierarchy of Russia's command structure proved a major liability. Local commanders lacked authority to make real-time decisions, while Central Command in Moscow seemed paralyzed by the unprecedented nature of the crisis. It took nearly a month before Russia could organize anything resembling a counteroffensive, and even then, the results were lackluster. Only after several months and the infusion of foreign troops did Russia begin clawing back territory, and even then at immense cost. The institutional failures revealed in Kursk run deep. The Soviet-style military model, built around rigid planning, mass manpower, and heavy reliance on centralized control, collapsed when confronted with Ukraine's adaptive, decentralized and tech-savvy approach. The battle exposed not just tactical weaknesses, but also systemic problems: corruption in logistics, inflexible doctrines, and the inability to rapidly innovate in the face of new challenges. The international implications of this incursion were just as profound. By mid-2024, Western analysts were increasingly pessimistic about Ukraine's prospects. Attritional warfare seemed to favor Russia, whose larger population and military-industrial base gave it long-term advantages. Many feared Ukraine was losing momentum and that Moscow would grind out victory through sheer persistence. But Kursk changed that narrative overnight. For the first time, Ukraine showed not just defensive resilience, but offensive capability on a scale few thought possible. Ukrainian tanks rolling through Russian villages, Ukrainian troops establishing aid centers on occupied Russian soil. These images captured global attention and revitalized public support in the West. Skepticism among NATO leaders quickly turned to admiration, even shock, at Ukraine's ability to pull off such an audacious move without even consulting its allies beforehand. This mattered immensely for Western policy. The boldness of Kursk provided political cover for hesitant leaders in Washington, London, Berlin, and beyond to escalate support. Within months, restrictions on the use of Western-supplied weapons were loosened. Long-range ATACMS missiles, once withheld for fear of triggering Russian nuclear retaliation, were authorized for strikes inside Russia itself. Storm shadows from Britain followed. Even German-supplied systems, previously restricted to Ukrainian soil, began appearing in operations across Kursk. The most remarkable outcome of this shift was the collapse of Russia's so-called red lines. Since 2022, Putin had repeatedly warned that attacks on Russian territory with Western-supplied weapons would trigger nuclear escalation. These threats constrained NATO policy for years. Yet in Kursk, Ukrainian forces not only crossed the border, but did so using Western equipment. NATO tanks and vehicles rolled across Russian villages, and still no nuclear response. The bluff was exposed. This revelation reverberated across global security policy. Western leaders realized that Putin's nuclear threats were more rhetoric than doctrine. If he wouldn't use nuclear weapons to stop foreign-equipped troops occupying Russian soil, what scenarios would he realistically act on? The credibility of Russian deterrence was shattered, and with it, much of Moscow's ability to control the escalation ladder. But why Kursk specifically? The answer lies in how Russia managed its own army. To fuel offensives in Donbass and southern Ukraine, Moscow had systematically stripped its border regions of professional contract soldiers, replacing them with barely trained conscripts and territorial defense units. These conscripts had little experience, outdated weapons, and virtually no expectation of ever facing combat. Against battle-hardened Ukrainian troops with years of experience, they were hopelessly outmatched. The centralized command structure made this worse. Conscripts trained only to follow preset orders had no flexibility when Ukrainian tactics deviated from the script. Many surrendered en masse rather than die defending poorly prepared positions. Over 1,000 Russian soldiers were captured in Kursk, providing Ukraine not only propaganda victories but also valuable intelligence. Many of these POWs were later exchanged for Ukrainian soldiers, some of whom had been held since the earliest days of the war. Russia's desperation soon reached new lows when it turned to North Korea for help. In October 2024, roughly 11,000 North Korean elite Troops arrived in Kursk under the terms of a newly minted defense agreement between Pyongyang and Moscow. Marketed as special forces, these units quickly proved disastrously unprepared for modern warfare. Within just 3 months, around 40% of the North Korean contingent had been killed or wounded. Their tactics, rooted in outdated Korean war doctrines, emphasized mass infantry, assaults, suicidal in the face of Ukrainian drones and precision artillery. Their attempt to counter drones by designating one soldier as bait while others tried to shoot it down with rifles was as ineffective as it was tragic. Language barriers compounded the chaos. North Korean troops, who spoke no Russian, struggled to coordinate with Russian units, leading to friendly fire and botched maneuvers. Arriving without their own weapons, they were handed obsolete Russian gear, placing them at a further disadvantage. Worst of all, they were entirely unprepared for the relentless surveillance of modern warfare. Under constant observation by Ukrainian drones, they lived in perpetual fear of strikes that could wipe out squads in seconds. By January 2025, the North Koreans had been temporarily withdrawn from frontline positions due to catastrophic losses. But by February, they were redeployed after retraining, only to repeat many of the same fatal mistakes. The spectacle of Russia, relying on foreign troops to defend its own territory, underscored the hollowness of Putin's boasts about Russian military power. As Zelensky quipped, Russia had humiliated itself by relying on North Koreans to plug holes in its defense. Technology was another critical factor in Kursk's success. Ukrainian engineers fielded advanced electronic warfare systems capable of corrupting Russian navigation data, sending guided munitions wildly off course. Drone swarms integrated with long-range strike systems allowed continuous surveillance and precision attacks. This made it nearly impossible for Russia to advance without being spotted and targeted. At the same time, Ukraine leveraged psychological warfare effectively. By setting up humanitarian aid centers in occupied Russian towns, Ukrainian troops provided food and medical assistance to civilians while documenting their compliance with international law. This contrasted sharply with Russia's behavior in occupied Ukrainian territories and undermined Moscow's propaganda about Ukrainian Nazis. The media strategy was just as important. Footage of Ukrainian troops inside Russia flooded global news and social media, shaping narratives of Ukrainian strength and Russian weakness. For Western publics weary of a grinding stalemate, this was a dramatic morale-boosting shift. Still, Kursk was not without flaws. The operation's biggest logistical weakness was its supply line. The entire incursion depended heavily on a single reliable road through Sumy. This bottleneck hampered resupply efforts, leaving Ukrainian forces vulnerable to attrition. By early 2025, Ukraine's equipment losses began to outweigh Russia's in the region, prompting a gradual withdrawal to avoid a collapse. Ukraine, however, learned from these shortcomings. In March 2025, Kyiv launched another cross-border incursion, this time targeting Belgorod. Unlike Kursk, Belgorod offered better road connectivity and terrain, more favorable to mechanized infantry. Ukrainian forces used this to conduct pincer attacks and apply air pressure more effectively. The invasion served primarily as a diversion, tying down Russian forces that might have otherwise reinforced Kursk or Donbas. 1 year on, Ukraine still clings to a small pocket of Kursk territory, just a few square miles in size. While modest in scale, this outpost acts as both a buffer against Russian attacks into Sumy and a staging point for future strikes. The cost to Russia has been staggering, $70,000 or casualties to reclaim roughly 500 square miles. At such a rate, the war risks devolving into a generational conflict of attrition, with neither side able to claim decisive victory. The broader lesson of Kursk is profound. The incursion demonstrated that modern warfare is no longer dictated by sheer numbers or outdated doctrine. Instead, it is shaped by technology, adaptability, and the ability to innovate quickly. Ukraine's success in Kursk proved that a smaller force, if well prepared and flexible,